Carol had lived with Roger's secret for more than a decade. 12 years earlier, she had discovered that her husband sometimes liked wearing women's clothing. At first, the discovery had made her uncomfortable. She didn't understand it, and she certainly didn't want to be involved in it. Over time, however, the shock faded. Roger understood her boundaries and never forced the subject. As long as he kept that part of his life private, Carol chose to ignore it. Apart from this unusual secret, Roger was a caring husband. Their biggest disagreement had always been the housework. Although both of them worked full-time, Carol somehow found herself responsible for most of the cooking, cleaning, laundry, and other daily chores. Everything changed when Roger's job was restructured. He narrowly avoided losing his position, but the new arrangement meant working only 3 days a week for less pay. Roger attempted to make up the difference with consulting work, but nothing substantial came from it. Suddenly, he had several extra days at home. At first, he kept himself busy. He repaired things that had been broken for years, redecorated parts of the house, worked in the garden, and completed projects he had always postponed. Eventually, though, there was little left to do. Carol saw an opportunity. "If you're going to be home more than I am," she told him, "then you can take on more responsibility around here." Roger couldn't really argue with that. Before long, most of the household chores had become his responsibility. Carol knew that he owned only a small collection of women's clothing himself, mostly special outfits he kept hidden away. On his days at home, however, he sometimes wore old dresses and skirts that Carol no longer used. Every Wednesday, Roger would spend the day cleaning the house, washing clothes, and taking care of the ironing. Surprisingly, Carol no longer found the situation as strange as she once had. The house was cleaner than it had ever been. The laundry no longer piled up, and Carol finally had time to relax after work instead of beginning another round of chores. Once, while admiring how neat everything looked, she jokingly told Roger that her new housekeeper was doing an excellent job. Roger looked so pleased by the comment that Carol almost laughed. 4 months, their unusual arrangement remained completely secret. Carol never mentioned it to anyone, and she assumed Roger hadn't either. Then, one afternoon, she made a careless mistake. Carol was visiting her old friend Betty, a talented dressmaker who made everything from simple alterations to elaborate costumes. While looking through Betty's latest creations, Carol noticed a doll wearing a tiny maid's uniform, complete with an apron and cap. Without thinking, Carol smiled. "Oh, Roger would love that." The moment she spoke, she wished she could take the words back. Betty looked up. "What do you mean?" she asked curiously. "I didn't know Roger was interested in dolls." Carol froze, searching for an explanation. But after a few awkward seconds, she realized she had already revealed too much. With a sigh, she decided to tell Betty the truth, or at least part of it. She explained Roger's reduced work schedule and how he had gradually taken over most of the household chores. Betty listened without interrupting. When Carol finished, Betty smiled. "That sounds rather entertaining," she said. "Don't tell me you make him wear an apron while he cleans." Carol could easily have laughed and changed the subject. Instead, she hesitated. Something in Betty's expression suggested that she might already understand more than she was saying. So Carol admitted that Roger sometimes dressed that way by choice. Betty's reaction surprised her. She didn't laugh. She didn't look shocked. Instead, she simply nodded. "You'd be surprised how common that sort of thing is," Betty said. "There are plenty of people with interests they prefer to keep private." Carol stared at her. "And how exactly do you know that?" For a moment, Betty said nothing. Then she smiled and poured them both a drink. "Well," she said, settling back into her chair, "since you've trusted me with your secret, perhaps I should tell you one of mine." And with that, Betty began a story Carol had never expected to hear. Years earlier, Betty had worked as a seamstress in a fashion house. After her marriage ended, she decided to use her skills to build a business of her own. She began by taking small orders from local customers, repairs, alterations, dresses, and costumes. Her reputation slowly grew. One of her biggest opportunities came when she designed costumes for a local theater group. The work was successful, and soon more people began approaching her with unusual requests. One evening, a young man from the group contacted her about having a costume made for a party. Betty invited him over to discuss it. When he arrived, she immediately noticed how nervous he was. She suggested several possible costume ideas, but none seemed to interest him. Finally, she asked him directly what he had in mind. After a long silence, he admitted that he wanted to attend the party dressed as a woman. Betty remained professional and asked what kind of outfit he wanted. His answer came even more quietly. He wanted a maid's costume. That was the beginning of an experience that would eventually change the direction of Betty's business forever. Peter remained part of Betty's life long after that first commission. Over time, he became a trusted friend and occasionally helped her test ideas, offer opinions, or model costumes when she wanted to see how a new design looked. Then one day, Betty received a request unlike any she had handled before. A woman phoned to ask whether Betty could create a maid's costume similar to one she had seen in Betty's advertisements. The caller explained that it was intended for her daughter's husband. Betty initially assumed the request was a joke or perhaps part of an elaborate party plan. She soon discovered otherwise. At the appointed time, 3 women arrived at her door. An older woman stood at the front, speaking with confidence and authority. Behind her were 2 younger women who were guiding a 4th person between them. The 4th visitor was wrapped in a coat and scarf and seemed deeply uncomfortable. Within moments, Betty realized the person was a man who clearly did not want to be there. The older woman directed the others to take him into the lounge while she remained behind to explain the situation. Once they were alone, she spoke calmly. The man, she explained, was her son-in-law. In her opinion, he had behaved badly toward her daughter for far too long, and she had decided that he needed to learn a lesson. After seeing Betty's advertisement, she had formed an unusual plan involving a set of custom-made maid's costumes. Betty found the request extraordinary, but the women were completely serious. When she entered the lounge, the reluctant customer was already being encouraged to cooperate while his wife and sister-in-law watched with barely concealed amusement. The older woman gave Betty clear instructions. She wanted 3 different costumes, each with its own style. One would be black, another pink, and the third yellow. All of them were to be elaborate and highly decorative. The price did not concern them. They paid without hesitation. Several weeks later, after Betty completed the order, she received a package in the post. Inside were photographs showing the costumes being worn during various household tasks, along with a short note thanking her for her work. The note ended with an interesting detail. The women had already recommended Betty to someone else. By the time Betty finished her story, I could hardly believe what I had heard. Yet, strangely enough, I also felt relieved. Betty clearly understood that people sometimes had private interests that others might not immediately understand, and she had never judged Roger because of his. Eventually, our conversation moved on. But just as I was preparing to leave, Betty looked at me thoughtfully. "Carol," she said, "isn't Roger's birthday coming up soon?" "Yes," I replied. "The 23rd. Why?" A mischievous smile appeared on her face. "If he's been doing such a wonderful job around the house," she said, "perhaps he deserves something special. What if I made him a proper maid's outfit?" I wasn't sure how to respond. The thought of Roger discovering that Betty knew about his private hobby made me nervous. Betty, however, assured me that she meant no harm. She said it would simply be a thoughtful surprise and even offered to make it as a gift. Over the following weeks, she asked me a few questions about Roger's measurements and promised that everything would be ready before his birthday. Then she made another suggestion. She wanted to visit that afternoon and see his reaction for herself. I hesitated, but Betty was remarkably persuasive. She insisted that Roger might enjoy the surprise more than I expected. When his birthday finally arrived, I gave him the usual presents first, a new shirt, aftershave, and a few other small gifts. Then I brought out the largest parcel. Roger looked puzzled as he opened it. Inside was the costume Betty had created. It was beautifully made, a dark dress with a crisp white apron, a matching cap, and carefully designed layers beneath the skirt that gave the outfit an elegant, theatrical appearance. Roger stared at it for several seconds. "It's beautiful," he finally said. Then he looked at me. "But, how did you know? Where did you get this?" I took a deep breath. "Betty made it." His expression immediately changed. "You told Betty?" I quickly explained that the secret had slipped out by accident and that Betty had simply wanted to make him something special. Roger was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. "Well," he said at last, "I suppose it was a thoughtful thing to do." Later that afternoon, after some encouragement, He agreed to try it on. He went upstairs to get ready. A short time later, the doorbell rang. Betty had arrived. I told Roger who it was and encouraged him to come downstairs when he felt ready. Eventually, he appeared in the doorway. He looked nervous, but there was also a quiet pride in the way he wore the new outfit. Betty smiled approvingly. "Very impressive," she said. "Although I think you may have been a little enthusiastic with the finishing touches." Roger immediately looked embarrassed. Betty laughed gently. "But tell me," she continued, "what do people call you when you're dressed like this? Surely you don't still think of yourself as Roger?" He looked completely caught off guard. I've never really thought about it." "So you don't have a name?" Roger shook his head. Betty turned to me. "What about you, Carol? Have you ever imagined one?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I smiled. "Actually, I have." Both of them waited. "For some reason," I said, "I've always thought of him as Rosie." Betty's face lit up. "Rosie," she repeated. "That suits perfectly." She turned toward Roger. "Well then, Rosie it is." Roger looked as though he didn't know whether to laugh or hide. Betty had also brought along a small decorative accessory for the outfit, a playful, theatrical finishing touch that matched the costume's elaborate style. She adjusted a few details, stepped back, and admired the overall effect. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Now everything looks complete." Roger remained visibly flustered by all the attention. "This is a rather strange birthday," he admitted. Betty laughed. "Think of it as a performance," she told him. "Today, you're simply playing a part." With that, she helped him complete the outfit. The carefully layered underskirts were particularly impressive. They gave the dress a dramatic shape, and Roger couldn't resist turning toward the mirror to admire the result. "All right, Rosie," Betty said. "Time for the final piece." Roger raised his arms, and Betty carefully helped him into the dress. She adjusted the sleeves, fastened the back, and tied the white apron neatly around his waist. Finally, she placed the small frilled cap on his head. Then Betty stepped away with a theatrical gesture. "There we are," she announced. "Your maid is ready for duty." Roger blushed and gave a shy little curtsy after Betty encouraged him to. "You look wonderful, Rosie," I said. "Betty has done an amazing job." Roger studied his reflection again. "It really is beautifully made," he admitted. "Almost too nice to wear while doing housework." I smiled. "Oh, I'm sure we can find something for you to do." Betty laughed, clearly delighted by his reaction. I looked around the room and pretended to consider the matter seriously. "Well," I said, "since we now have such an efficient maid in the house, I think afternoon tea would be a good place to begin." Roger blinked. Then he understood. With another small, embarrassed curtsy, he smiled. "Yes, madam." He left the room to prepare the tea while Betty and I exchanged amused glances. As we watched him disappear into the kitchen, Betty leaned closer to me and whispered with a smile, "I have a feeling that costume will get plenty of use."